The government and Tories there are trading barbs over Canada's support for Ukraine, with new polling today showing a big drop in Canadian support for the aid our government is sending to Ukraine. To date, Canada has committed $9.7 billion in aid to Ukraine. The Angus Reid Institute asked Canadians back in May of 2022, and again this month, if they agreed with the statement, Canada is sending, quote, too much support to Ukraine. Back in May of 2022, 13% of those polled felt that way. This month, that number has almost doubled to 25%. There's also waning attention being paid to the war here, according to Angus Reid. In May of 2022, two-thirds of Canadians polled said they were following the war closely. Fewer than half say the same now. Here to dig into the consequences of those numbers, former Conservative Defence Minister Jason Kenney is with us. He's now a senior advisor at Bennett Jones. And former Liberal Defence Minister David Collenette is here in studio. He's the chair of the NATO Association of Canada. Hello to both of you. Really glad to have you with us this evening. Mr. Kenney, I'll start with you. That first number, that top line number, the number of Canadians compared to May of 2022 who are uncomfortable with the level of aid, does that surprise you, given how many years now we're into this war, or how long we're into this war?
Perhaps not entirely surprising. I think there is a degree of fatigue setting in. People are not following this every day like they did when the Russian invasion first began 2 years ago. And I suspect that the de facto stalemate has also caused some people to think that that Ukraine is in a very difficult position as it is. Having said that, it is disturbing. It's discouraging because Canada has broadly been one of the most supportive Western democracies of Ukraine and its territorial sovereignty. I do take some solace from the poll. It continues to show majority support for Ukraine and support for Canadian material aid to Ukraine. So I would just hope that both of the main party leaders could pursue that in a greater sense of bipartisan consensus, as opposed to using this as a political wedge tool, which I think the government has done too easily and frequently.
Let me ask you, Mr. Collenette, about that, because we just spent the last segment talking to politicians. It has very much become political in this country, in maybe not, I should say conclusively, not in the exact same way as the United States, but in the United States, it's become highly political as well, too. What are your thoughts on the potential impact of that in the long term?
Well, Vassy, I always look at things from the glass being half full. And in this poll, it looks like only about 25% of Canadians say we're doing too much. And we have to break that down in a minute. So that means that most Canadians are in support of the effort to help Ukraine. And there's been bipartisan support, and that's what Jason has said, and that has to continue. There is a small group here, small group in other countries, European countries, and in the United States that are against the ongoing funding for Ukraine. But behind these numbers, it seems that the fall off is really mainly with conservative supporters. And so this is of concern to all of us, because it doesn't matter how you vote in an election. We want all Canadians to have a consensus in supporting Ukraine. But the number of conservatives who feel that there's been too much support has gone from about 19% to 43%. And that is concerning. But we're seeing this in the United States, where a small group of Republicans are really holding up a consensus that is in the Senate and in most of the House of Representatives. So these are worrying things. It's not surprising, really, as wars go on, and then we have other events that are taking place, the tragedy in the Middle East, and then we have the general preoccupation with the economy, the cost of living, housing, food prices. Canadians have a lot on their plate. So we just have to keep our focus to make sure that Canadians know that we must continue to support Ukraine, because this is an existential issue that's facing us. If Vladimir Putin succeeds in Ukraine, then we really do have a problem.
Mr. Kenney, you've both been in cabinet. I wonder, just jumping off that point, if you're looking at these numbers today and you're in the government, you're in the opposite, what is the best way to confront them? Is it more explaining of how you perceive the aid to be necessary, what you perceive the threat from Vladimir Putin to be, what would happen if Russia were to win? I just wonder if what is necessary in order to counter the growing sentiment among Canadians that they might be just a bit unsure.
Yeah, I think all of those arguments are necessary. I am puzzled to some extent about the trend on the conservative side of the spectrum to which David refers. After all, Stephen Harper was, I think, without a doubt, the strongest Western ally of Ukraine. He's the guy who, and part of Prime Minister Harper's popularity in his own base was his moral clarity on foreign policy, in particular against Vladimir Putin, famously saying at a G7 summit, I'll shake your hand just so I can tell you, get out of Ukraine. I was the Minister of Defense who deployed Operation Unifier in 2014-15, which became the main training program, very successful. We were early in providing military support to Ukraine, satellite images. We signed, the Harper government signed a free trade agreement. There was absolutely no doubt about our closeness to Ukraine. I think a couple of things have happened. One, and I don't want to be guilty of what I accused the Prime Minister of, but I think we just saw with that clip with Melanie Joly. The Liberals are in a bit of a electoral freefall right now. They're grasping at straws, and they've decided to make this one of those straws. They've decided to take what I think is a relatively small disagreement about a carbon tax and a modified trade agreement and turn that into a cudgel. And I got to tell you, Vashi, I think you know that amongst conservative voters, there is so much deep animosity towards the Prime Minister that I suspect some of that is bleeding over into this issue the more he tries to use it as a wedge. So I really think they all need to get away from that temptation. Secondly, and regrettably, I do think there is some bleed over of American populist alt-right media into a certain segment of Canadian conservatives who generally don't follow mainstream Canadian media much anymore. And so I think some of those opinions, we saw Tucker Carlson's welcome in Alberta recently by some people. Right. He's the #1 voice of skepticism towards Ukraine and effectively support for Vladimir Putin. He's in Moscow interviewing Putin today. So that, I think, has been very unhelpful in the opinion environment on the right of center.
Mr. Collenette, your thoughts then on, I think Mr. Kenney paints a pretty accurate picture of all the sort of external forces and internal in some cases. What do you do if you're the government and you want to maintain that level of aid and you want Canadian support behind it?
Well, the government just has to continue to get its message out. I think Mr. Trudeau's government has done an excellent job in the amount of funds that has been offered to Ukraine, equipment, manpower. I think we've done a very good job as a country, and until now, we've had bipartisan support. This issue that occurred in the House over the last few weeks and was voted on today is something that I really find politically unsettling. I think that if Mr. Poilievre had, made his case about carbon pricing and his objections to it, he uses that in debate, and that's fine, but then says, notwithstanding that, we are going to stand with the people of Ukraine and vote for the free trade agreement, the changes. I think that would have been a better way to go at it. I think this is perhaps going to cause him some problems within his own conservative support. And as I said, 43% now of conservatives say that we're doing too much. But what about all the rest of those conservatives who are absolutely in support of helping Ukraine? So I think we've got to get it away from this partisanship and get it back to the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, it's an existential threat. Vladimir Putin cannot succeed in Ukraine. Those of my generation have grown up into in a world that has been actually almost ideal without conflict. And now we are seeing atrocities being committed in the heart of Europe. And if this particular issue is not resolved favorably to support Ukraine, then I fear for what that means for all the NATO countries and all the European countries, but also spilling over to other parts of the world.
Okay, I have to leave it on that note. I really appreciate both of you making the time for the conversation. Former Defense Ministers Jason Kenney and David Collenette.